For 7 long days, he waited, trapped, starving, alone in the darkness. His desperate cries were swallowed by the city's noise. No one knew he was there. Until a miracle happened. The sun had long since set over the city, painting the sky in shades of deep indigo and bruised purple. Streetlights flickered to life, casting a cold, artificial glow over the deserted roads. Beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary night, buried deep within the bowels of an old storm drain, a pair of golden-brown eyes reflected the dim light from above. They belonged to Max, a German shepherd, once strong and proud, now trembling with exhaustion and fear. Max had been missing for a week. His fur, once a sleek coat of black and tan, was now matted with dirt and streaked with dried blood from countless attempts to claw his way out. The drain was cold, damp, and unyielding. Water trickled through its depths, carrying debris from the streets above. The concrete walls rose high around him, forming an unforgiving prison that mocked his every attempt to escape. He had barked, he had howled, but the world had been too loud to hear him. Far above, in a small house on the edge of town, there was a boy who hadn't slept in days. Ethan was only 10, but the weight of worry had aged him beyond his years. His small hands clutched a worn-out photograph of Max, his best friend, his protector, his shadow. Every night since Max had disappeared, Ethan had sat by the window, waiting, hoping. Any news? His voice was barely above a whisper. His father, Daniel, stood by the doorway, exhaustion carved into his features. He had spent hours putting up posters, calling shelters, driving through the city, searching every possible place Max could have wandered off to. But deep down, he feared the worst. Daniel sighed. "Not yet, buddy." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the photograph. "He wouldn't just leave. He's out there. I know it." Daniel knelt beside him, resting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep looking." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Dogs didn't just disappear without a trace. And if Max was still alive, where could he be? Max wasn't just a pet. For Ethan, Max had been his guardian, his constant source of comfort since the loss of his mother 2 years ago. The German shepherd had sensed Ethan's grief in a way no human ever could. He had sat beside the boy in the quiet of the nights when sorrow pressed too heavily on his chest, his presence steady, warm, unwavering. He had been there when Ethan woke up from nightmares, his damp nose nudging against the boy's trembling hands, reminding him he wasn't alone. For Daniel, Max was a lifeline, a promise he had made to his late wife, that Ethan would never feel alone in this world. He had never been a dog person before Max, but something about the shepherd had changed that. His intelligence, his loyalty, the way he seemed to understand every unspoken emotion. Max was more than just a dog. He was family. And now he was gone. The day he disappeared had been like any other. Ethan had been playing in the backyard, tossing a ball for Max to chase. The boy's laughter had filled the air as Max bounded after it, his ears perked up, his tail wagging. Then, one moment of distraction. A noise from the street, a sudden rustling, a cat darting across the yard. Max had bolted. By the time Ethan had called his name, by the time he had scrambled after him, Max was gone. The search had started immediately. Ethan and Daniel had scoured the neighborhood, calling for him until their voices were hoarse. The days turned into nights, and still, there was no sign of him. The posters went up, the shelters were notified, but the city was a vast, indifferent maze. And somewhere, deep beneath it, Max was waiting. The drain had become his world. He had survived on the stagnant water that pooled near his paws, but hunger gnawed at his ribs. His once powerful legs felt weaker by the day. His throat ached from barking, his body stiff from the cold. But he couldn't give up. Something deep inside him, the instinct that had always guided him, the love that tethered him to the boy who had never let him down, kept him going. Every night, when the city grew quieter, he would tilt his head back and let out a low, mournful howl. It was his only hope, his only way of reaching the world above. The days blurred together in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. The air in the drain was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rotting leaves. The noise from the city above was muffled, distant, a cruel reminder of the life he had been torn from. Memories drifted through Max's foggy mind. The warmth of Ethan's bed, the scent of pancakes in the morning, the sound of laughter echoing through the house, the feel of Ethan's small hands scratching behind his ears. He whimpered, his body trembling with weakness. Then, one night, a noise. A sound different from the usual traffic, different from the distant hum of voices and engines. Footsteps. A flicker of hope ignited in Max's chest. He forced himself up, his legs shaking beneath him. He barked, loud, desperate, his voice raw from days of calling out. The footsteps hesitated. A shadow passed over the opening of the drain. A voice, uncertain, cautious. "Did you hear that?" Another voice, closer this time. "Yeah, it's coming from down there." Max barked again, his tail wagging weakly. The voices murmured, and then, suddenly, there was light. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on Max's weary form. A gasp. "Oh my God, it's a dog." Max's heart pounded. He tried to stand taller, his ears perking up despite his exhaustion. Someone had finally heard him. Someone had finally come. Above the drain, a man pulled out his phone. "Call the number on the posters," he said to his friend, his voice urgent. "I think we just found Max." Back at home, Ethan sat by the window, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He had barely eaten, barely slept. His father had tried to convince him to rest, but how could he? How could he sleep when Max was out there, lost, alone? Then, the phone rang. Daniel, who had been sitting in the kitchen, practically lunged for it. "Hello?" A pause. His breath caught. "Wait. What? Where?" Ethan sat up, his heart hammering. Daniel's eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in days, hope. "We're on our way." As he hung up the phone, he turned to Ethan, his voice thick with emotion. They found him. For the first time in days, a sob broke free from Ethan's chest. "Let's go," Daniel said, grabbing his keys. Ethan was already at the door. Max was waiting. The car tore through the empty streets, the streetlights casting fleeting glows across Ethan's tear-streaked face. His fingers dug into the fabric of his jeans, knuckles white, heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Every second felt like an eternity. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched. He wanted to drive faster, wanted to fly down the road at reckless speeds, but he forced himself to stay steady. The last thing they needed was another disaster. The voice on the phone had been clear. Max was alive. He was weak. He was trapped. But he was alive. Ethan held onto those words like a lifeline. When they finally reached the spot, a dimly lit street lined with cracked pavement and forgotten buildings, Ethan was out of the car before it had even stopped moving. A man with a flashlight turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. "You're the owners?" "Yes," Ethan gasped. "Where is he?" The man stepped aside, pointing toward the storm drain. Ethan scrambled forward, his sneakers skidding against the pavement. And then he saw him. Maximum. The German shepherd lay at the bottom of the drain, barely moving. His fur was caked in mud, his ribs pressed against his skin, his once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. But when Ethan called his name, Max's ears twitched. His head lifted, just slightly. Ethan choked back a sob. "Max, it's me. Hang on, buddy. We're gonna get you out of there." Max tried to move, his paws scraping against the wet concrete, but his body betrayed him. He whimpered, his tail giving a weak, hopeful wag. Daniel was already pulling out his phone. "We need help," he muttered. "There's no way we can get him out ourselves." The storm drain was deep, too deep for Ethan to reach in. The opening was narrow, the walls slick with moss and grime. Even if Daniel climbed down, getting Max back up would be nearly impossible. Animal control is closed at this hour, the man who had found Max said grimly. You might have to call the fire department. Daniel cursed under his breath. The fire department would take time. Too much time, and Max didn't have time. Ethan didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He moved before anyone could stop him. One moment, he was on the edge. The next, he was slipping down the concrete wall, his hands grasping at whatever foothold he could find. His sneakers slid, his fingers burned against the rough surface, but he didn't care. Ethan! Daniel's voice was sharp with panic, but Ethan had already dropped to the bottom of the drain. The smell was thick, wet stone, rust, decay. Water sloshed around his shoes, seeping into his socks. But none of it mattered. Max was here. Ethan fell to his knees beside his best friend, his hands shaking as they touched Max's fur. It was cold, damp. The dog let out a soft, broken whimper, his tail brushing weakly against Ethan's leg. Ethan's voice cracked. You're okay. I'm here now. Max let out a breath, a long, slow exhale, like he had been waiting to hear those words. Above, Daniel's heart nearly stopped. Damn it, he swore, looking at the man beside him. I need to get down there. You won't fit through that opening, the man said grimly. The kid barely made it. Daniel felt helpless. He had spent days searching, had spent nights comforting Ethan, telling him they would find Max, that everything would be okay. Now his son was stuck at the bottom of a drain with a dog too weak to move, and he had no way of getting to them. Ethan was speaking softly to Max, but Daniel could hear the desperation in his voice. And then he saw it. A storm was coming. The wind had begun to pick up, rustling the trees, pushing discarded leaves across the pavement. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, rolling in like silent giants. Daniel felt dread coil in his stomach. If it rained, if water rushed into that drain, Max wouldn't stand a chance. Neither would Ethan. Daniel grabbed his phone with trembling hands and dialed. 911. What's your emergency? My son is trapped in a storm drain with our dog, Daniel said, barely holding his composure. We need rescue services immediately. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. What is your location? Daniel gave the address, his eyes locked on Ethan below. Are there signs of flooding? Daniel swallowed. Not yet, but there's a storm coming. The dispatcher paused, then said, Stay put. Help is on the way. But Daniel couldn't just stand there. Ethan stroked Max's head, whispering to him, We're getting out of here, okay? Max's breathing was slow, too slow. Ethan felt tears slip down his cheeks. He was just a boy. What could he do? He couldn't lift Max. He wasn't strong enough. But Max had never given up on him. So Ethan wouldn't give up on Max. He pulled off his hoodie, wrapping it around Max, trying to give him warmth. He positioned himself beneath the dog, his tiny arms straining as he tried to lift him. Nothing. Max let out a small, exhausted sigh, his head pressing against Ethan's lap. Ethan bit his lip. Come on, buddy. You have to help me. Above, Daniel paced. The minutes dragged by like hours. Then, sirens. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as a fire truck and an emergency response vehicle pulled onto the street. Firefighters jumped out, already assessing the situation. Boy down there with the dog? One of them asked. Daniel nodded frantically. Please, you have to hurry. The firefighter, his name tag reading Mitchell, grabbed a harness. We'll get them out. A ladder was lowered into the drain, but Ethan barely noticed. His focus was on Max. He felt himself shaking, whether from the cold or from fear, he didn't know. Hey kid, a voice called down. We're coming to get you. Ethan didn't respond. He just kept whispering to Max. I won't leave without you. The firefighter descended into the drain, his boots splashing in the shallow water. He knelt beside Ethan, his gaze soft. You did good, kid, he said gently. But we need to get you out of here first. Ethan shook his head. I can't leave Max. Mitchell glanced at the dog. Max was barely conscious, his body limp. The firefighter let out a breath. "All right," he said. "We'll get him out together." Ethan's face crumpled with relief. It took 2 firefighters, careful maneuvering, and a lot of patience, but finally, Max was lifted out of the drain. Ethan climbed up right after him, scrambling onto the pavement as Daniel caught him in a crushing hug. "I told you not to scare me like that," Daniel choked out. Ethan buried his face in his father's chest, sobbing. "He's okay. He's okay." Max was carefully placed onto a stretcher. An oxygen mask slipped over his muzzle. He was weak, barely responsive, but his golden brown eyes fluttered open, searching. When he saw Ethan, his tail wagged, just once. The paramedics rushed Max to an emergency vet, but Ethan never let go of his paw the entire ride there. The storm finally broke that night, rain crashing against the city. But Ethan didn't hear it. He only heard the slow, steady sound of Max breathing. He had made it. They both had. The rain came down in thick, unrelenting sheets, hammering against the windshield of the ambulance as it raced toward the emergency veterinary clinic. The flashing red lights reflected off the wet pavement, slicing through the darkness of the stormy night. Ethan sat on the cold metal bench inside, his small hands gripping Max's paw, as if he could somehow tether him to this world just by holding on. Max lay on a stretcher, his body still and his breathing shallow. The paramedics had wrapped him in blankets, placed an oxygen mask over his muzzle, and inserted an IV into his foreleg, but he remained eerily quiet. Too quiet. Ethan's chest ached. The weight of the past week, the nights spent crying into his pillow, the endless searching, the helplessness, settled over him like a crushing wave. He had found Max. He had saved him. But what if it wasn't enough? The ambulance hit a bump, jostling them slightly. Ethan barely noticed. He lifted Max's paw to his cheek. "Stay with me," he whispered. "You promised you'd never leave me." Daniel sat beside him, his large hand resting protectively on Ethan's back, but he said nothing. What could he say? There were no words to take away his son's pain, no words to make up for the helplessness he had felt watching Ethan disappear into that drain, knowing he might not have been able to pull him out in time. Daniel had never prayed much before, but now, in the silence of that ambulance, he prayed. Not for himself, for Max, for Ethan, for a miracle. By the time they reached the veterinary hospital, the rain had turned the streets into rivers. The paramedics rushed Max inside, disappearing behind white double doors before Ethan even had a chance to follow. Ethan tried to chase after them, but Daniel held him back. "Wait, buddy," he said gently, kneeling in front of him. "They need space to help him." Ethan shook his head furiously. "But he needs me." His voice cracked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's scared. He thinks I left him again." Daniel's heart splintered. He pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, his son's thin body trembling against him. "You didn't leave him," Daniel murmured. "You saved him." Ethan didn't answer. He just buried his face in his father's chest, his small hands gripping the fabric of Daniel's jacket. A soft voice interrupted them. "Are you the owners of the German Shepherd that was brought in?" Ethan turned so fast he nearly stumbled. A woman in blue scrubs stood before them. Her name tag read, Dr. Collins. She had kind eyes, but there was a deep furrow in her brow. Daniel straightened. "Yes, he's stable for now, doctor." Collins said, "But he's in critical condition." Ethan's breath caught. What does that mean?" The veterinarian sighed. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. His body is weak from lack of food, and his muscles have deteriorated from being stuck in that drain. He also has an infection from a wound on his leg, most likely from trying to claw his way out." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could will away the horrifying images those words conjured. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "What can we do?" "We're giving him IV fluids, antibiotics, and pain medication," Dr. Collins said. "But the biggest risk is his organs shutting down from prolonged starvation. Right now, we just have to wait and see how he responds to treatment over the next 24 hours. Ethan wiped at his face with his sleeve. Can I see him? Dr. Collins hesitated, then nodded. Come with me. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the hum of medical machines filled the small recovery room. Max lay on a padded bed, covered in a soft blanket. Wires ran from his body to monitors that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Ethan's heart clenched. Max had always been so strong, so full of life. Seeing him like this, fragile, unmoving, was unbearable. Ethan stepped forward, his sneakers squeaking against the tile floor. He knelt beside Max, careful not to disturb any of the wires. Hey, buddy, he whispered, stroking Max's head. I'm here. Max's ear twitched slightly at the sound of Ethan's voice. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. Even Dr. Collins seemed surprised. Ethan smiled through his tears. You heard me, didn't you? Max's tail gave the faintest, weakest wag. Dr. Collins exhaled softly. That's a good sign. Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't going to leave Max. Not again. He curled up beside him on the floor, resting his head on his arms, never letting go of Max's paw. And for the first time in a week, he slept. The next few days were a battle. Max's condition remained critical. Some moments were hopeful. His tail would wag, his eyes would flicker open, he would nuzzle against Ethan's hand. But other moments were terrifying. His breathing would slow, his heart rate would dip, the machines would beep in warning. Ethan never left his side. Neither did Daniel. They took turns sleeping in the waiting room, holding on to every ounce of hope they had. Dogs like Max are fighters, Dr. Collins told them. He's been through hell, but he's still holding on. Ethan refused to believe in anything else. On the third day, something changed. Ethan had been reading to Max, his voice soft, comforting, when Max's nose twitched. Then, slowly, his head lifted, and his eyes met Ethan's. Dad! Ethan gasped. Look! Daniel rushed over, his breath catching in his throat. Max's eyes were open, not just flickering, fully open. Ethan let out a choked sob. Max! The German shepherd blinked. Then, with trembling effort, he lifted his head slightly and licked Ethan's hand. Ethan burst into tears. He's back. Daniel pressed a hand over his mouth, his own eyes wet. Yeah, buddy, he's back. Dr. Collins rushed in at the sound of the commotion. When she saw Max alert, she let out a breath of astonishment. I don't believe it, she murmured. He shouldn't have recovered this fast. But he had. Because Max had something stronger than medicine. He had Ethan. By the end of the week, Max was sitting up. By the second week, he was eating small amounts of food, regaining his strength. And on the 15th day, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Collins finally smiled at them and said, He's ready to go home. Ethan nearly tackled Max in excitement. Did you hear that, buddy? We're going home. Max's tail thumped against the floor, stronger than it had in weeks. Daniel crouched down, scratching behind Max's ears. Welcome back, pal. Max nudged his head into Daniel's chest, his way of saying thank you. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, pressing his face into his fur. I missed you so much. Max huffed softly, licking Ethan's cheek. I missed you too. The drive home felt different. The sun shone brighter. The world felt warmer. And as they pulled into the driveway, Ethan turned to Max and whispered, You never gave up on me. Max tilted his head, his golden eyes full of understanding. And Ethan knew, Max hadn't just survived. He had fought. For Ethan, for home, for love. And now, after everything, he was finally where he belonged. The moment Max stepped back into the house, it was as if something had shifted. The air felt lighter, the space warmer. Ethan had imagined this moment over and over, the way Max's paws would click against the hardwood floor, the way his tail would swish as he walked through the familiar rooms. But Max was different now. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if testing the ground beneath him, His ribs still showed beneath his fur, his muscles still weak from the days spent trapped in that cold, unforgiving drain. He wasn't the same powerful, energetic dog he had once been, but he was here, and that was enough. Ethan knelt beside him, running his fingers through Max's fur. "You remember, don't you?" he asked softly. "This is home." Max let out a deep sigh, pressing his head into Ethan's chest, as if trying to reassure him. Ethan closed his eyes. It wasn't over. Max was safe now, but the road to recovery was just beginning. That night, Max curled up at the foot of Ethan's bed, just like he always had. But something was different. Ethan woke up to the sound of restless movement. He blinked groggily, rubbing his eyes. The room was dim, the moonlight spilling through the curtains. And then he saw Max. The German shepherd was shifting, his paws twitching as if trying to run. His ears flicked back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Max?" Ethan whispered, sitting up. Max let out a low whimper. A nightmare. Ethan felt his heart break. He had never seen Max like this before. His strong, fearless protector, now the one who needed protection. Ethan slid off the bed, lying down beside Max on the floor. He rested a gentle hand on his side, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his breathing. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're not there anymore." Max shifted slightly, his body still tense. Ethan curled against him, just like Max had done for him so many nights before. "I won't leave you," he murmured. "You didn't leave me. I won't leave you." Little by little, Max's breathing steadied. His body relaxed, and for the first time since he had been rescued, he slept peacefully. The next few weeks were slow, careful steps toward healing. Max's appetite returned first. Dr. Collins had warned them that he would need small, frequent meals to rebuild his strength. Ethan took on the responsibility with unwavering dedication, measuring out Max's food, making sure he ate every last bite. Then came the short walks. At first, Max barely made it down the driveway. His legs were too weak, his body too frail, but he refused to give up. Every day, Ethan walked beside him, patient, encouraging. "Just a little further, buddy," he would say. "You got this." And Max, with that same unwavering loyalty, followed him. By the end of the second week, they made it to the park. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from their house, but it felt like a victory. Ethan watched as Max sniffed the grass, his tail wagging slightly. The wind ruffled his fur, and for the first time in weeks, his ears perked up. The world was his again. But then, a car door slammed nearby. Max froze, his body tensed, his ears flattening. He lowered himself to the ground, his tail tucked between his legs. His breathing turned shallow, his golden eyes darting wildly. Ethan's heart sank. Max wasn't afraid of loud noises. He never had been. But now? Now he was reliving the moment he had been lost. The honking of cars, the rush of footsteps, the cold, endless darkness that had swallowed him whole. Ethan knelt beside him. "Max, it's okay," he said softly. "You're safe." But Max didn't move. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. This wasn't just about healing Max's body. His mind, his heart, had been wounded too. Daniel had told him once that trauma didn't just go away. That sometimes, even when everything was okay, a part of you still expected the worst. Max had saved Ethan from his grief. Now it was Ethan's turn to save him. The next few weeks were slow. Ethan learned Max's triggers: sudden noises, confined spaces, being alone for too long. Each time, Max would freeze, his body trembling with fear he didn't understand. But Ethan never gave up. When Max was scared, Ethan sat with him. When Max hesitated, Ethan waited. "Take your time, buddy," he would whisper. "I'm not going anywhere." And Max, little by little, began to believe him. One afternoon, Ethan decided to take Max back to the backyard. It was the last place he had been before he disappeared. The last place he had felt safe before his world had turned upside down. Ethan tossed a ball gently onto the grass. Max stared at it. Ethan swallowed hard. "Come on, buddy. Just like before." Max didn't move. Ethan crouched beside him. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. "You're home." Max let out a soft huff, and then, tentatively, carefully, he took a step forward. Ethan held his breath. Another step. Max lowered his head, sniffing the ball. His ears flicked back, his eyes uncertain. Ethan didn't push him. He just waited. Then, slowly, Max reached out and picked up the ball. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes. Max turned toward him, the ball in his mouth, his tail giving the faintest wag. Ethan laughed, brushing at his face. "You want to play, buddy?" Max dropped the ball at his feet. And just like that, they were whole again. The next morning, Ethan woke up to a familiar feeling, a warm, solid weight beside him. He blinked, adjusting to the early morning light, and then he saw him. Max, curled up at his side, his head resting against Ethan's chest. Just like he used to. Ethan let out a shaky breath. Max had spent weeks sleeping on the floor, too restless, too afraid to settle beside him. But now, he was home. Ethan buried his face in Max's fur, his heart swelling. "I love you, buddy," he whispered. Max let out a deep, contented sigh. For the first time in weeks, there was no fear, no hesitation, just warmth, just love, just home. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the house as the warmth of the day faded into a soft, comforting dusk. Inside, laughter echoed through the kitchen as Ethan and Daniel finished dinner, with Max curled up on his favorite rug near the table. For the first time in weeks, everything felt right again. Max was still weak, but his strength was returning. His coat, once matted with dirt and exhaustion, had been carefully washed, revealing the sleek black and tan fur that Ethan loved so much. His ribs still showed, but the food Ethan had been carefully giving him was helping him put on weight. His eyes, though tired, held the same familiar warmth, trusting, loving, full of quiet understanding. Ethan couldn't stop watching him, afraid that if he looked away for too long, he might wake up and realize this had all been a dream. "Kiddo," Daniel said, nudging Ethan's plate toward him. "Eat." Ethan blinked, realizing he had barely touched his food. "I'm not that hungry." Daniel sighed, but didn't push. He knew. The past few weeks had left their mark on both of them. Max shifted on the rug, lifting his head just enough to rest it against Ethan's foot. The warmth of him, the solid weight of his presence, sent a surge of comfort through Ethan's chest. "You worried about him?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice gentle. Ethan nodded. I don't want him to be scared anymore." Daniel leaned back in his chair, glancing down at Max. "You know, I think he's more worried about you." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel smiled. "Ever since we brought him home, he's been watching you like a hawk. Wherever you go, he goes. It's like he knows you're still holding on to everything that happened." Ethan swallowed hard. Max had always been like that, always in tune with him, in a way no one else was. When Ethan had lost his mom, Max had been the one to sit beside him, to press against him in silent comfort when the grief was too much. And now, after everything Max had been through, he was still thinking about Ethan before himself. "Dogs are funny that way," Daniel continued. "They don't dwell on the past the way we do. They just want to be with the people they love." Ethan looked down at Max, at the soft rise and fall of his breathing, the way his ears twitched slightly at the sound of their voices. Max had been trapped, alone, starving in the dark. He had fought his way back, and now, despite everything, all he wanted was to be here, with Ethan. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he whispered, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ear. "He's home now." Max huffed softly, as if in agreement, and Ethan finally took a bite of his food. For the first time in weeks, It didn't taste like worry. The next few days were full of small victories. Max took his first full walk around the block, his tail wagging slightly as he sniffed at familiar spots. He still tired easily, and Ethan was careful not to push him too hard, but every step forward felt like a win. Then came the moment that nearly brought Ethan to tears. They were in the backyard. Ethan had tossed a ball, not really expecting much. Max had simply watched it roll across the grass, his ears flicking, his body still hesitant. But then, something in him changed. Maybe it was the wind, carrying the familiar scent of home. Maybe it was the way Ethan looked at him, patient, hopeful. Or maybe it was just that Max finally felt like himself again, because he stood, shakily at first, and took a slow step forward, then another, and then he ran, not far, not fast, but enough to reach the ball, enough to pick it up in his mouth, tail swishing ever so slightly. Ethan let out a breathless laugh, his eyes burning with happiness. "You did it, buddy." Max turned back to him, the ball in his mouth, his golden brown eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in weeks. Joy. Ethan knelt, opening his arms, and Max trotted straight to him, dropping the ball at his feet before pressing his head against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in his fur. "You're really back," he whispered. Max let out a soft, contented sigh. Yeah. He was back. That night, as Ethan got ready for bed, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. He climbed under the covers, expecting Max to curl up at the foot of the bed, like he had been doing since they brought him home. But tonight, Max did something different. He hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, pressing close to Ethan's side, just like he used to. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and curled an arm around him. "I missed you," he murmured. Max huffed softly. "I missed you too." And this time, when Ethan closed his eyes, there were no nightmares, only warmth, only peace, only home. The morning light streamed through Ethan's bedroom window, casting a golden glow over the room. Max stretched beside him, his body warm, his breathing steady. For the first time in weeks, Ethan had slept without waking up in a panic. When he opened his eyes, Max was already watching him, those deep brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. Ethan grinned, reaching over to ruffle Max's fur. "Morning, buddy." Max let out a contented sigh, pressing his head into Ethan's chest. This was what he had been waiting for. Ethan had spent so many nights wondering if they would ever get back to this moment, if Max would ever feel safe again, if he would ever feel whole again. Now, as he lay there with his best friend beside him, he knew the answer. They had made it. Downstairs, Daniel was already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, again. Ethan laughed as he walked in, Max trotting beside him. "Are we just eating pancakes forever now?" Daniel smirked. "You complaining?" Ethan shook his head. "Nope." Max sat beside Ethan's chair, his ears perked up, clearly hoping for another tiny piece. Daniel sighed, tearing off a very small bite and tossing it to him. "I swear, you two have me wrapped around your fingers." Ethan grinned. "Pretty much." As they ate, the weight of everything they had been through settled into something lighter, something manageable. The fear, the worry, it was still there, lingering at the edges. But it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Max was getting better, and so was Ethan. Later that day, as they walked through the park, Ethan noticed something. Max wasn't flinching at every sound anymore. He still tensed a little when a car door slammed nearby, but he didn't cower. He still hesitated before stepping onto unfamiliar ground, but he didn't freeze. He was healing, just like Ethan. Ethan knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. Max nudged his nose against Ethan's cheek, licking him once. "So did you." As they headed home, a thought struck Ethan. They had spent so much time worrying, so much time searching, so much time fighting to bring Max back. But how many other dogs out there were still waiting to be found? How many people were still waiting for their best friend to come home? That night, after dinner, Ethan pulled out his laptop. He started searching, reading about lost pet foundations, animal rescues, volunteer programs. Daniel walked by, peeking over his shoulder. "What are you up to?" Ethan looked up. "I want to help," he said simply. Daniel sat down beside him. "Help how?" Ethan turned the screen toward him. "There are people who search for lost pets, volunteers who help find them, shelters that reunite them with their families. If Max was out there alone for a week, how many others are still waiting?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, he nodded. "That's a great idea." Ethan hesitated. "Do you think we could do it? Help other families the way those people helped us?" Daniel smiled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Kiddo, I think you can do anything." Ethan beamed. Max wagged his tail, as if giving his approval. They had been given a second chance. Now, it was time to pay it forward. As Ethan climbed into bed that night, Max curled up beside him again, just like he always had. Ethan smiled. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If you've ever loved a pet like family, if you know the pain of losing them and the joy of bringing them home, don't give up. Keep searching, keep hoping. And if you can, help those still waiting, because every lost soul deserves a way back home.